handling a brush is not for everyone, so in today's video, I gave acrylic markers a try for painting miniatures, but not the ones designed specifically for this purpose, which can set you back quite a bit. Instead, I picked up a set of more generic markers, to see if there's actually something useful here for the hobby. I am approaching these small projects from the perspective of someone who simply isn't comfortable using a brush. Not an artist, not someone chasing display quality results. Just someone who wants to get some color on their tabletop models. So with that in mind, I wanted to avoid using any other mediums, or doing any touch-ups with the brush. For my first attempt on this ghost, the coverage over a white primer was fast, opaque, and achieved in a single coat. And as I moved on to adding some highlights, being used to the thinner body of a paintbrush made things feel a little bit awkward at first. But I quickly found there are basically two types of strokes you can aim for. You can either press down to create a thicker line, or you lightly graze the surface, to create thinner ones using just the tip of the marker. And funnily enough, my experience with the brush didn't help much here, as I found it surprisingly tricky to maintain those thinner lines for long. Since smooth blending was pretty much out of the question, a rougher, sketchier style was naturally the direction I ended up taking, which, as I have shown in the past, isn't necessarily a bad thing, and honestly has a charm of its own. Although, one thing I could have improved was going for thicker, or rather double-lined highlights for that first layer. Having both my first and second highlights be roughly the same thickness forced me to avoid placing a thinner line inside the previous one. Not because I didn't want to, but simply because of the limitations of the tool. Instead, I had to aim for a shorter highlight placed over the previous layer. But in the end, I've gotta say the result wasn't bad at all. While definitely a bit sloppy for a first try, with a bit more practice I am sure I could come up with something I'd be more than happy to put on the tabletop. But it is important to point out that I also held myself to a model without too much detail or texture. The ghost was essentially a blank canvas, where I could experiment to my heart's content. But now, as I move on to a more traditionally detailed model, things became a bit trickier. On one hand, getting the base coats down wasn't too bad, but some areas were simply impossible to reach because of the sculpt itself, leaving small white gaps here and there. And when I moved on to the highlights, this time I had a more cel-shade comic book style in mind. And while the thicker body of the markers actually lends itself quite nicely to that sort of look, truth is, easy to access areas like the pants were simple enough to work with, and as I gained more experience with the tool, I was definitely able to manage thinner lines a bit better. But on the other hand, hard to reach areas were simply impossible to tackle, and with the tool having clear limitations in both the thinness of the lines you can achieve and the areas you can physically reach, not only were the details like the face pretty much a lost cause, but adding those thin, black outlines so characteristic of comic book cel shading was also completely out of the question. So far, one good result and another not so much. And honestly, that's usually how trying something new goes. Sometimes the tool isn't the problem. Sometimes you just haven't found where it shines yet. And at this point, it's becoming very clear that the model you choose will heavily determine just how far you can push the result, if it is even feasible at all. For my last little project, the model itself had some decently sized details I knew I could manage. And more importantly, it didn't have any complex twists, folds or hard to reach areas that would fight against the tool. This time the inspiration came from the game Morkborg, and I decided to stick to the game's characteristic colors, only this time making use of a black primer, to intentionally leave some black lining showing in between my yellow highlights. And I've gotta say, while I was definitely a bit skeptical at first, even a notoriously troublesome color like yellow covered surprisingly well over black, so maybe there really is some potential here for cel-shaded style, so long as a bit of planning goes into where you want that black primer to remain visible from the start. But back to the model at hand, I found the color palette of black, yellow, pink and white to be surprisingly pleasing, and honestly quite a striking combination. It is definitely a bit gimmicky, and probably not for everyone. But if you have been around this channel for a while, you'll know I've always had a soft spot for schemes like this one. Whether it was the living statue, the moonlit scheme, or some of the other more unconventional projects I've shared in the past. There is something I find really refreshing about stepping away from what miniature painting is supposed to look like. Because as much as I enjoy a gritty, realistic, or traditional painted miniature, sometimes trying something a little unusual can break that sense of routine that quietly builds up over time. And more often than not, those gimmicky schemes, the ones that maybe don't take themselves too seriously, end up being some of the most enjoyable projects to work on. Not because they demand perfect blends or razor-sharp edge highlights, because they give you permission to simplify, to exaggerate, and to focus more on the overall idea than on every little detail. And there is something incredibly relaxing about that. When you are not constantly second-guessing every brushstroke, or in this case, every marker stroke, your mind gets a chance to switch off a little. The hands keep moving, the model slowly comes to life, and before you know it, you're no longer thinking about painting at all. You're just enjoying the process. And honestly, whether that's while listening to music, a podcast, or in my case, a good audiobook, those are often the painting sessions I end up enjoying the most. Thank you for watching. While not very educational, I hope that you found today's video a bit entertaining.